Hello, and welcome back to the Arcane Forge. My name's Josh, and today we're going to be doing another Commission Corner, kind of. We're going to do like a fusion of a Commission Corner and a Monster Monday. We're going to be making a hybrid video. It's going to be very lore heavy. It's going to include monsters that you can use in your game. It's going to be a commission of someone's monster that they have homebrewed, kind of. It's confusing, but it's really good. And today's commissioner was Yorick Bisse over on Patreon, who has very kindly decided to share the lore and mythology and stats even and everything of this homebrew type of giant known as Slag Giants. It was a really fun one to do. I'm very excited about it, a little bit overwhelmingly excited. So I will just skip to where we start the video and we can carry on from there. But thank you for joining me and enjoy this video on Slag Giants. So today we have a rare treat. Much like the subject of today's video, the style of today's video is a hybrid. Something of a fusion between a Commission Corner and a Monster Monday, in that this is definitely a commission that I worked on, but it's also a fascinating homebrew creature created by one of my patrons who's provided a lot of lore and some actual stats to use these creatures in-game. So for those who don't know, I do commissions for my patrons over on Patreon, usually through a Commission Corner raffle, where because of my limited time, I tend to pick one person totally at random out of my entire Patreon list. I ask them for a brief description of something that they'd like illustrated, usually a character from their campaign, and then I illustrate that. But that's not the only way to get a commission from me. The great old ones, my highest pledge level, are people who I get to chat to every single month. We have a one-on-one video chat with each other, where we can do things like, just shoot the breeze and chat about your campaign, talk through ideas, maybe workshop some things. But I can also screen share and present my screen to you, and we can draw something together. I can come up with something to draw while we're chatting, and piece by piece, sometimes month by month, we will make something together that you really wanted to see. And that's the case for today's commission, which belongs to Yorick Bisse, also known as the Jurassic Show, one of my longest standing patrons and one of my longest term viewers. So thank you so much for your support, Yorick, and for agreeing to let me film this video. Now, if you're a part of our community on Discord, if you watch our live streams and so on, you've no doubt found Yorick. He's very active in the comment sections of everything. Very, very enthusiastic community champion. And one of the first things that will come up about Yorick is that he's obsessed with giants, really, really loves giants. And he includes giants in his D&D campaigns that I have never heard of. He doesn't exclude the ones that are in the Monster Manual or anything like that, but he has tons and tons of experience with various different types of giants. Whether they're ones that have been included in older editions of D&D, if they've been in Pathfinder, if they're his own homebrew creations, and so on. And today we're covering a creature that is kind of one of his homebrews, the idea of what we're calling a Slag Giant, which caused us no end of humour, because obviously in the UK that term is used not only for its actual purpose, meaning stony waste matter separated from metals during the smelting or refining of metallic ores, but also has a pejorative term for people who are particularly promiscuous. Something that Yorick was not aware of when we started this, but it caused me a bit of shock until I realised exactly what we were talking about. But yes, he means the sort of waste earth that comes off of the top of ore that's being melted, because the Slag Giant is a hybrid creature, an offshoot species, that has both Fire Giant and Stone Giant ancestry. Now, this is a drawing that we came up with together. We kind of workshopped. It was a really interesting process. I really like doing commissions while the commissioner is present, because we can kind of talk about, what items of clothing you want to include, what bits of personality you want to add. We can tweak things at the sketching phase and stuff like that. You're literally there, sort of hovering over my shoulder invisibly, as it were. So if something's not right, you can tell me right away, and we can kind of make it absolutely what you envision, which is great. Now, usually as well, when I ask for some information about what character we're producing and things like that, I'm given some information to go on. But because these creatures are in D&D's lore, because these are creatures that Yorick is so familiar with, and because of his giant enthusiasm, when I asked for a bit of information here, he sent me not only a stat sheet that allows people to use these in-game, hopefully, which I'll be able to share with you. I'll see if there's a way for us to do that. And if Yorick's comfortable with that, then I'll make sure to leave that down below in my description box, because hey, free monster. But also, he's given me lore, notes about these things' origins in and outside of game. He's basically written me a Monster Monday script So thank you so much for all of this amazing information. I'm basically going to read verbatim, minus a few notes here or there, what Yorick has provided, because it's sensational and definitely worth sharing with the community. So I hope you enjoy this Monster Monday Commission Corner hybrid. So Yorick mentions that initially Slag Giants were actually a thing. They're not entirely his own sort of headcanon, but they're from Pathfinder 1st edition. And he really liked how they appeared there, but it didn't necessarily gel with the concept of them for him. So we got to work on that a little bit. At one point, I thought, with the name like Jurassic Show, Yorick sort of shares my affinity for prehistoric creatures. And he asked that we put the skull of a Triceratops, mainly to show sort of like scale of this creature, but also just for fun, as one of this creature's shoulder plates. But that also happens to be a reference to Yorick's other absolute obsession, Transformers, the Transformers franchise, where there is a Dinobot also called Slag, or formerly called Slag. Apparently, Hasbro found out, as I mentioned before, that Slag is considered a very rude word in the UK, and this character's name was quickly changed to Slug to avoid that misinterpretation, but the community still remembers. Yorick says that these oddly proportioned 18-foot tall hybrids are very rare, but they also hold the title of the first, quote, new giants being born into existence even before the Great War with dragons. Unlike what one might assume with the rarity of slag giants, they're not the result of any loathing or rivalry between fire and stone giants, but rather because of the different environments between the two, rendering meetings between the two of them few and far between. He said that due to their mixed heritage and upbringing, slag giants inherit many conflicting behavioural traits from both parents, often swaying between the cold indifference of the stone giants and the fiery passion of the fire giants, or their fiery rage contrasted with the stone giants' nearly endless patience. While most slag giants are seen as mostly equal by both stone and fire giants, they are mostly looked down upon by cloud giants, who see their misshapen bodies as signs of, quote, what happens when you're not part of Anam's grand design, end quote. Some even going so far as to use their position to ban marriages between stone and fire giants so more won't come into existence. Fortunately, most of these bans have been lifted after the Great War with Dragons. Now, Misshapen Bodies is something that Yorick mentions here, and was one of the obstacles that I needed to overcome in this illustration, because the stone giants and the fire giants are traditionally depicted very, very differently. Now, you can obviously sort of homebrew how you want any of your giants to look, but in D&D lore and canon, fire giants are traditionally sort of like scaled up dwarves. They have usually fairly short limbs, compact bodies. They're very thick and tough, very muscled and gnarled. The stone giants, by contrast, are usually very stretched and elongated. They have long, thin heads and enormous gangly arms. So we kind of worked together on what this might end up looking like. We thought maybe having large hands and large feet with shorter legs and sort of long, gangly limbs with perhaps sort of sinuous muscle, keeping the stone giant sort of thinner and longer head, but with a fire giant sort of shorter neck and their broad shoulders. Came up with a fascinating way of sort of depicting their skin tones as well, because stone giants generally have this sort of, mottled grey, spotted kind of, stone textured skin. And fire giants generally have sort of shades of red or orange, or more often than not, sort of igneous stone, this sort of like deep grey or jet black colour to their skin. So looking at things like brindle dogs and various forms of sort of metamorphic stones, he came up with the idea of having these creatures have these wild sort of marblings, a bit like cracked earth, with fragments of bright orange intermingled with deep, cool greys. It made for a really interesting skin tone. I really enjoyed it. He mentions that they have a surprisingly lonely life. He says, despite most of them being born out of love, or at worst, arranged marriages, slag giants occupy an odd position due to their oddly proportioned bodies. They aren't as fast as either of their parents, due to most of their strength of their legs being used to carry their slightly oversized torsos and far too broad shoulders. Therefore, most of them prefer the calmer lifestyle of their stone giant parents, though many still choose to live and help their fire giant parents as best as they can despite their physical handicap. Because of their rarity, the largest slag giant clans have only numbered between 12 and 20 members, thus many will likely go their entire 575-year-long lifespans without meeting another slag giant, causing many of them to adopt exotic and monstrous pets like owlbears, giant spiders, dinosaurs, and even sometimes gorgons, I would imagine, to sort of quell their isolation. He goes on to say that having not been created by design by the giant gods, slag giants have had to cut their own niches in the ordning wherever they can, usually fulfilling the roles of coin, jewelsmiths, and exterminators, usually wiping out infestations of goblins and kobolds with their massive metal boots and double-bladed scythes, which they also use against more human-sized intruders. However, the most prolific and important role they have managed to fulfill are as architects, helping to plan and build massive temples and prisons for the larger giants. Surprisingly, a lot of slag giants also take on work as mercenaries for humanoid armies, leading bands of hill, fog, river, or wood giants who have no choice but to follow them, since they technically outrank them in the ordning. After a battle is won, they'll scavenge the weapons and armour of the dead for later use in metalwork. Now, the scythe and these boots are very particular elements that Yorick was keen on. We've discussed this a little bit in the past, and with his affinity for giants, we often talk about what sort of weapons and tools a creature that size, a life that size, would need to wield. When they're in giant communities, perhaps they would be able to use tools similar to what we do, but when dealing with smaller creatures, which it seems the majority of the world is largely accommodating, they might need more sort of polearms and things with a lot of reach. So Yorick mentioned that perhaps scythes of some kind or another might be how they deal with armies of smaller creatures, lopping off their heads like wheat, or just as fire giants tend to use these large metal boots to stop themselves from being attacked by tiny creatures and to crush them under the sheer weight of these things. Slag giants do something fairly similar, with almost like cleated, crushing boots designed to prevent people from climbing on them and to crush them underneath the weight of their massive feet. With their strong affinity for metallurgy, he's given these creatures an 18 armor class using half plate, which we tried to accommodate as much as possible. There was a lot of leather, aprons, and so on to show their affinity for a forge, but also these large chained bands, the Triceratops skull, and this enormous plated shoulder pad, and so on, means that these guys would definitely be capable of crafting themselves half plate. He gave them a resistance to cold damage and an immunity to fire damage, likely due to their fire giant heritage, and with 24 strength, which is a +7, he made them challenge rating 9. They have 26 constitution and are far smarter than the average human with 16 intelligence, but perhaps due to their isolation, they only have 8 charisma. Like a lot of giants, he made these things siege monsters, dealing double damage to objects and structures. And as well, their affinity for architecture probably means that this is a really good feature for them as well. They can probably identify weak spots in the architecture of lesser creatures. And thanks to their heritage from stone giants, he gave them slag stone camouflage, which means that they have advantage on stealth rolls when they remain motionless against certain types of rocks. He was very specific about the types of weapons that this creature would use, including a very intricately designed falchion for cracking through armor, which here deals 5d6 +7 slashing damage, and like most giants, they have a rock-flinging attack, a ranged throwing weapon, which deals 4d10 +6 bludgeoning damage. In addition, he's given them a fling ability, which allows them to try and throw a small or medium creature they can see within 10 feet. Creatures that don't manage to dodge out of the way of being grabbed in this way are thrown horizontally 60 feet, potentially taking 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet that they were thrown, as long as they hit something on their way. He's given this double-headed scythe some stats, striking all creatures who don't manage to pass a dexterity saving throw to dodge out of the way of this thing's semicircular path, causing them to take 4d8 +7 slashing damage. And they have 2 different boot attacks. One sort of stomp, which does 4d10 +8 bludgeoning damage against a single target who needs to make a dexterity saving throw, otherwise they'll be knocked prone by the sheer force of this stomp, and a metal boot attack, which is far more like a kind of This Is Sparta style kick, which deals a similar amount of bludgeoning damage, but causes creatures to need to make a strength saving throw or be knocked in a massive straight line miles away from this giant. In addition, he's given this creature a reaction, something called rock catching, potentially to do with their acceptance or lack thereof among their giant kin. As we know, all giants seem to have some kind of rock throwing ability, and in this reaction, it says that if a rock or a similar object is hurled at the slag giant, the giant can, with a successful DC 10 dexterity saving throw, catch the missile and take no bludgeoning damage from it instead. instead, presumably due to their long, gangly arms and impressive strength. But this was an absolute hoot to draw, and even better to see all this amazing lore that Yorick has come up with. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you get to use creatures like this in your game. Like I say, I'll hopefully leave a link to this down below in my description box if this is something that I can share. And if you have any similar creatures like this that you'd like to see me draw, come and say hi on Patreon, because you never know, there's always a chance that we would get to illustrate this thing together and share it with the rest of the community. What a wonderful gift. So thank you, Yorick, for both your support and for this creature, for the lore and for the stats. And to the rest of you, I hope you have a lovely week, and until I see you next time, happy monster hunting.